Section 1. The birth of controversy. There is a small piece of construction paper, cut into the rough shape of a child, standing somewhere in Colorado. It is 1992. Nobody knows what it is yet. The two young men who made it are film students at the University of Colorado, laughing at their own jokes in a darkened editing room, having no idea that this crude little shape, this paper silhouette, is going to spend the next 3 decades making governments, religions, celebrities, and entire nations incredibly uncomfortable. This is the story of South Park versus everyone. Specifically, it is the story of South Park versus the United States government, which is a sentence that sounds absurd until you realize it actually happened multiple times, in multiple ways, with escalating stakes and increasingly dramatic consequences. We are going to go through all of it tonight, slowly, thoroughly, from the very beginning. The small moments and the enormous ones, the internal battles and the geopolitical ones, the episode that got banned from a country of 1.4 billion people, the episodes that came with death threats and FBI investigations, and the season that earned an official condemnation from the actual White House, which then watched the show's ratings soar to their highest point in nearly 3 decades. So settle in. Let the familiar hum of your space heater, or your fan, or whatever ambient noise you keep going at night, wash over you. Because we are going to be here for a while, and by the time we are done, you are going to understand something about this show that most people who have watched it for years never quite put together. South Park was not born as a television series. It was born as a small act of creative chaos that got loose in the world before anyone could stop it. And it has been spreading through cultural ventilation systems ever since. Trey Parker and Matt Stone met at the University of Colorado at Boulder. Parker had already shown a specific kind of creative recklessness. He won a Student Academy Award for an animated short using a paper cutout style that was, even then, deliberately crude, deliberately childlike, and deliberately subversive. Stone was studying economics. They met in a film class, hit it off immediately in the way that people do when they share an identical and slightly deranged sense of humor, and spent most of their time doing impressions and laughing rather than attending lectures. This is worth noting, because a lot of what defines South Park comes directly from this origin: two friends making each other laugh, with very little concern for whether anyone else finds it acceptable. In December of 1992, they made their first short film together, a 5-minute piece of construction paper animation that they called The Spirit of Christmas. It featured 4 kids' rough prototypes of what would eventually become Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny, who accidentally bring a snowman to life. Then Jesus shows up to fight it. It was screened at a student film festival, got some laughs, and then essentially vanished. It was too rough, too weird, and too strange to go anywhere on its own. But something about it stuck in the back of their minds. 3 years later, in 1995, a Fox broadcasting executive named Brian Graydon saw something in Parker and Stone's work. He paid them $2,000 to create a new version of The Spirit of Christmas as a digital video, Christmas card he could send to his friends and colleagues in the entertainment industry. Parker and Stone took the commission, reportedly spent around $750 on actually making it, pocketed the difference, and got to work. This time, the snowman was replaced. The new villain was Santa Claus, and the hero opposing him was Jesus Christ. The two figures meet in front of the 4 kids, still construction paper, still crude, still unmistakably handcrafted, and they beat each other senseless in a genuine, bloody brawl while the children watch and narrate with spectacular profanity. Kenny gets killed. Kyle is established as Jewish. The foundation of the entire show, every single load-bearing idea, is right there in those 5 minutes. Graydon sent the short to approximately 80 friends and colleagues in December of 1995. And here is where the story becomes genuinely strange. One of the recipients was rumored to be George Clooney. The tape got copied, then copied again. Then someone digitized it and put it online. At a time when the internet was so young that most households did not have an email address. People were huddling around office computers, passing floppy disks and VHS cassettes, sharing this thing like it was contraband. And in a sense it was. It was a cartoon where the founder of Christianity and the patron saint of Christmas gifts try to beat each other to death while elementary school children swear with extraordinary creativity. In the context of 1,995 American media, that was genuinely revolutionary. Not edgy, revolutionary. This is the thing that the rest of the story depends on understanding. South Park did not become controversial when it became successful. It was controversial before it existed as a television show. It went viral in the most literal sense of the word, spreading person to person through informal networks, before YouTube, before streaming, before social media, before most of the infrastructure that makes things go viral today existed at all. The mechanism of its creation was itself a kind of small cultural disruption. Nobody authorized it, nobody marketed it. The show's DNA was in its first breath. Something that spreads because people cannot stop showing it to each other. Because it does something they have never seen before. Because it says something that no one is supposed to say. Comedy Central's executive Doug Herzog watched the short after it had been circulating for a while and commissioned Parker and Stone to develop it into a series. The development process was not smooth. The very first focus group to see the pilot reportedly despised it, with their formal recommendation being to throw the entire thing away. But Comedy Central's president of programming, Eileen Katz, believed in it. She later described the feeling of watching the pilot as one of the rare moments where the planets align and everything comes together at once. Which is an extraordinary thing to say about a show whose first episode is titled Cartman Gets an Anal Probe. But she was not wrong. The planets were aligning. They were aligning around something that would make a very large number of people very uncomfortable for a very long time. To understand how jarring South Park was when it actually arrived, you have to remember what the television landscape looked like in August of 1997. The Simpsons was the most controversial animated series on American television, and it had been on the air for 8 years. It was rated TV PG. Bart Simpson's wildest offense was making prank phone calls. Beavis and Butthead had pushed some boundaries on MTV, but it read clearly as a teenage show, both in aesthetic and in sensibility. There was nothing on American television that prepared anyone for what South Park was about to do. The level of profanity, the religious satire, the graphic cartoon violence, the sheer sexual content, all of it delivered through an animation style that looked like a 5-year-old had cut it out of construction paper, was genuinely without precedent. Variety's Ray Richmond, reviewing the pilot in August of 1997, wrote that South Park was like Peanuts meets A Clockwork Orange. The innocence of children's animation fused with the ultraviolence of dystopian satire. That description still works. It might be the most accurate 6 words anyone has ever written about the show. On the 13th of August 1997, Cartman Gets an Anal Probe aired for the first time at 10 in the evening on Comedy Central. It pulled a Nielsen rating of 1.3, translating to approximately 980,000 viewers, which was considered an enormous number for basic cable at the time. And the reaction was immediate. Not just from audiences, but from parents' groups, school administrators, religious organizations, and media commentators who were not entirely sure what they had just witnessed. The Parents Television Council declared the show so offensive it should not have been made. Schools began banning South Park t-shirts. A group of school principals in New Jersey launched a campaign specifically to warn parents about the show's content. Hickory Flat Elementary in Georgia issued an outright ban on any clothing featuring South Park imagery. And a poll, conducted by NatWest Bank in the United Kingdom in 1999, found that 8 and 9-year-old children had voted Eric Cartman as their favorite personality, not favorite cartoon character, but favorite personality above real human beings. Parent councils on both sides of the Atlantic lost their minds. But here is the thing that is easy to miss when you are talking about the very early days. The show was not just fart jokes and swearing. In that same first season, an episode called Big Gay Al's Big Gay Boat Ride aired on the 3rd of September 1997, and it was one of the most sympathetic, genuinely warm portrayals of a gay character that had appeared on American television at that point. That episode was nominated for a GLAAD Award for Outstanding TV Individual Episode. The Parents Television Council was calling for the show's cancellation at the same time that GLAAD was considering giving it an award. Both of those things were true simultaneously, and that tension between the vulgarity and the genuine heart underneath it is the core engine of everything that comes after. South Park was not offensive for the sake of being offensive. It was offensive in service of something. Not always. Not perfectly. But almost always there was a point. And the point mattered. The show's crude animation style, which has remained intentionally unchanged across 28 seasons, is itself a form of argument. Parker has discussed in interviews how the decision to keep the look simple was not just about budget, though the budget was always modest, but about function. The paper cutout aesthetic creates a cognitive dissonance that is central to the comedy's power. You are watching something that looks like it was made by children in an art class, and you are hearing things that could not possibly be intended for children. And the gap between those two experiences is where the humor lives. It creates permission. It tells your brain to relax. Because look, it is just construction paper, it is just a silly little cartoon, even as it proceeds to say something that has never been said on television before. This is also why the outrage was so specifically intense in the early years. It was not just that the content was offensive. It was that the content was offensive while wearing the aesthetic clothing of innocence. A mature joke told in a mature style is one thing. A mature joke told in a children's style is something else entirely, because it appropriates the visual vocabulary of safety and then subverts it completely. Parents who stumbled across their children watching South Park felt, in addition to whatever specific objection they had to the content, a deeper sense of having been ambushed by something that looked harmless. The show used its innocent appearance to get through the door and then said something you did not expect it to say. And this was, in the very literal sense of the word, intentional. Parker and Stone understood exactly what they were doing with the aesthetic. The contrast was the joke. The incongruity was the engine. And 30 years on, it still works the same way. The show still looks like it could be something a child made, and it still sounds like something no child should be listening to, and the gap between those two things has not closed at all. If you are watching from somewhere interesting tonight, your bedroom, a late shift somewhere quiet, a comfortable chair with the lights low, drop a comment and let us know. Tell us the time and the place. It is always nice to know where in the world people are listening. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is a perfect moment. It really does make a difference for a small channel, and there is a lot more story still to tell. Section 2. The show hits the airwaves, and the world catches fire. Something remarkable happened to Comedy Central in the 12 months following South Park's debut. The number of households that carried the network jumped from 9.1 million to 50 million. That is not a typo. In a single year, in the span of time between August 1997 and June 1998, Comedy Central went from a channel that most cable providers treated as optional and slightly embarrassing to one of the fastest-growing networks in the history of the medium. And essentially all of that growth was driven by a crude cartoon about 4 children in a fictional Colorado mountain town. Advertisers who had previously been paying a maximum of $7,500 for a 30-second commercial spot during South Park were, within a year, paying an average of $40,000 for the same slot. Some paid as much as $80,000. The money was following the audience, and the audience was enormous. During the spring of 1998, 8 of the 10 highest-rated shows on basic cable television were South Park episodes. 8 out of 10. The show was not just popular. It was a phenomenon of a kind that cable television had not previously produced. And all of it was happening while the Parents Television Council was filing complaints, while school principals were sending letters home, and while media commentators were debating whether the show was going to corrupt an entire generation of children. There is a specific episode from the first season that tends to get overlooked in the controversy history, but that I think is worth spending time on because it establishes a pattern that runs through the show's entire relationship with authority. The 6th episode of Season 1, simply titled Death, aired on the 17th of September 1997, about 5 weeks after the premiere. In it, the boys' parents become horrified by a fictional cartoon they find their children watching a crude, violent, profane animated show called Terrence and Phillip. The parents launch a campaign to have the show canceled. They write letters. They organize. They are furious about the effect this content might have on their children. The joke, which is stated with the subtlety of a sledgehammer and is not trying to be subtle, is that the parents' reaction to the fictional Terrence and Philip is a perfect mirror of real-world parents' reactions to the very show those parents are appearing in. South Park was, less than 2 months into its run, making meta-commentary about its own cultural impact. The show was already commenting on the reaction to the show. It had achieved a level of self-awareness that most programs take years to develop, and it had done so while still in the single digits of its episode count. This is one of the things that made South Park genuinely unprecedented, rather than just unusually crude. Other shows generated controversy. Other shows pushed limits. But almost no other show at that time was examining its own controversy as part of its content, folding the external reaction back into the internal narrative, using the criticism as material. South Park was not just a controversial show. It was a show that thought carefully about what it meant to be controversial, and made that thinking visible to its audience, and invited its audience to participate in the meta-level awareness of what was happening. You watched South Park and you were watching a show about what it was like to watch South Park. By the time the first season's Nielsen rating had climbed from that initial 1.3 to a 6.4 by the 10th episode, it was clear that something was happening that the traditional tools of cultural outrage could not stop. Banning t-shirts did not stop kids from watching. Letters home from concerned principals did not stop parents from letting them watch. The complaint emails that flooded Comedy Central's inbox did not slow the show down. If anything, each new wave of outrage seemed to push the ratings higher, because controversy is essentially free advertising, and South Park had more controversy than it knew what to do with. The production process itself was part of what made all of this possible and all of this inevitable. From the 4th season onward, South Park episodes were written, voice-recorded, animated, and delivered to Comedy Central in approximately 6 days. 6 days from blank page to finished broadcast episode. The 2011 documentary 6 Days to Air, directed by Arthur Bradford, showed this process in extraordinary detail. Trey Parker pacing the writer's room at 2 in the morning, looking at nothing, talking to himself, trying to find the thing. Voice recording sessions happening while animation was still being finalized on other parts of the same episode. The crew pulling all-nighters measured not in hours, but in shifts, with Parker at one point describing a particularly brutal production week as looking like it would be not a 5 in the morning night but more like a 9 or 10 in the morning night. The episode gets finished and transmitted to the East Coast just hours before it is supposed to air. Sometimes less than hours. Sometimes it is a question of minutes. This production schedule is the key to understanding almost everything about South Park's relationship with controversy. It means the show operates more like a live political cartoon than a traditional animated series. When a story breaks on Monday, it can be in an episode on Wednesday. No other scripted show on television can do that. The 6-day cycle makes South Park more like a daily newspaper than a weekly program, and it gives the controversies a rawness and immediacy that planned content simply cannot replicate. The jokes are fresh. The reactions are fresh. And sometimes the rawness cuts in ways that were not intended, because there is no time for reflection, no time for testing, no time for anyone to come to Parker in the morning and say, maybe we should think about this one a little longer. The early seasons of the show developed a kind of mythology around what it could and could not do. Comedy Central, for its part, had already started self-censoring almost immediately. The 5th episode of the series, An Elephant Makes Love to a Pig, aired on the 10th of September 1997, less than a month after the premiere. It had a subplot involving Stan's sister Shelley repeatedly setting him on fire, and then dousing him with water before setting him on fire again. Comedy Central pulled the scene after the initial broadcast, worried about the same kind of blowback that Beavis and Butthead had received for similar content. On the DVD releases, you can still see a pool of water beneath Stan that was left over from the deleted scene. On the Blu-ray releases, even that detail has been cleaned up. It is a tiny thing, but it tells you that the self-censorship started almost from the very first episode that was not the pilot. The network was nervous before it had even had a chance to see how nervous it needed to be. And then there was the Damien episode, and the Mr. Hanky the Christmas Poo episode, and Scott Tinnerman Must Die. And with each episode that pushed a little further, with each piece of mail that flooded the Comedy Central offices, with each school administrator who sent a note home, the show got bigger and bigger. And the people trying to slow it down found that they were essentially doing the show's marketing for it. Every condemnation was a recommendation. Every ban was an advertisement. The show had stumbled into one of the most durable dynamics in the history of media, the one where telling people they absolutely should not look at something guarantees that they look at it. By the end of the first season, Parker and Stone had written something that was simultaneously one of the most complained about and one of the most watched shows in the history of basic cable. They had received award nominations from GLAAD and death threats from strangers. They had been called everything from visionary satirists to moral criminals. And they had learned something that would define their entire career from that point forward. The controversy is not the problem. The controversy is the product. This understanding shaped the second season's most audacious moment, and it happened on the 1st of April 1998, which is April Fool's Day, and the timing was absolutely not a coincidence. The first season had ended on a cliffhanger. The finale episode was called Cartman's Mom is a Dirty Something, and the central mystery, the identity of Cartman's father, was left deliberately unresolved. Fans were told to tune into the second season premiere to find out the answer. This was peak South Park mania. People genuinely cared. They were invested. Comedy Central, riding the wave of the show's success, had been building anticipation for weeks. The season 2 premiere was going to be a cultural event. It arrived on the 1st of April 1998. The episode began with a recap of the cliffhanger, building tension, and then a title card appeared on screen. It read, "Not Without My Annis," starring Terrence and Phillip. Happy April Fool's Day. They did not answer the cliffhanger. Instead, Parker and Stone aired a full 22-minute episode about Terrence and Phillip, the fictional Canadian flatulence comedy duo, who existed as a show within the show, trying to stop Saddam Hussein from taking over Canada. 22 minutes of fart jokes. No Stan, no Kyle, no Cartman, no Kenny, no answer about the father. Just farts in Canada. Comedy Central received more than 2,000 angry emails within a week. Their phones were flooded. A Comedy Central spokesman actually acknowledged that fans had understood the joke, they just had not appreciated it. Some viewers abandoned the show entirely and never came back. The media compared Parker and Stone to Andy Kaufman, deliberately antagonizing their own audience as a form of performance art. Matt Stone's response, delivered to Entertainment Weekly, was characteristically direct. He said that if you got that angry over not knowing who a construction paper kid's father was, there was really something wrong with you. And the actual answer to the mystery, delivered in an episode called Cartman's Mom, is still a dirty something. Aired 3 weeks later on April 22, pulled an 8.2 Nielsen rating. At that point in time, that was the highest rating ever recorded for a non-sports program on basic cable television. So the prank, as infuriating as it was, had driven the ratings higher than they had ever been. Parker and Stone had done the thing. They had trolled their own audience, lost some of them, held the rest in suspense for 3 weeks, and then delivered a payoff that produced the biggest numbers in the show's history. The lesson was clear, and it would inform everything that came after. If you are willing to make your audience genuinely uncomfortable, if you are willing to push them past the point of polite entertainment into the territory of actual frustration or bewilderment or even brief anger, the payoff can be extraordinary. Not always. But sometimes, and sometimes is enough. Section 3. The April Fool's Legacy and the Shape of Early Outrage. The deeper pattern of South Park's relationship with authority and institutions started to reveal itself clearly in those first 2 years. It was not simply that the show was offensive. Lots of things were offensive. It was that the show seemed to be constitutionally incapable of treating anything as beyond its reach. Nothing was sacred, nothing was protected, nobody was owed a pass. And this applied not just to external targets, celebrities, politicians, religious organizations, but to the show itself, to Comedy Central, and to the audience. The Parents Television Council, which would become something like a permanent fixture in the South Park controversy story, kept an almost obsessive running tally of the show's infractions. They cataloged swear words, sexual references, violent imagery, drug use, and sacrilege with the thoroughness of people who had made it their life's work to be offended on behalf of others. And in a strange way, they were right about the content. South Park contained all of those things, and in generous quantities. Where they were wrong spectacularly and continuously wrong was in their assumption that documenting the offenses would lead anyone to stop watching. It had the opposite effect. Every report the PTC published was essentially a detailed program guide for what not to miss. There is a particular production detail from those early years that tells you something important about the philosophy behind the show. When the first season was finished, Parker and Stone recorded audio commentary tracks for every episode, intending for them to be included in the DVD release. Comedy Central listened to the commentaries and refused to include them, on the grounds that the commentary itself violated the network's standards. Parker and Stone refused to allow the commentary to be edited or censored. The result was that the behind-the-scenes content about the show was released completely separately from the show itself, on a set of 5 independent CDs. The bonus material about the controversial show was too controversial to be packaged with the controversial show. It is a perfect South Park situation. Meta-controversy inside meta-controversy, recursive outrage all the way down. Something worth understanding about those early years is how the animation style functioned as a specific kind of provocation. Parker has talked at length about how the crude construction paper look was not just a budget constraint, it was a deliberate aesthetic choice with a real comedic function. He has explained that the childlike visual style creates a kind of permission structure for the audience. If South Park looked like a Pixar film, the things it depicts would be genuinely horrifying rather than funny. The crudeness is what lets you laugh at things you would otherwise be appalled by. The medium is the shield. The paper cutout look creates distance between the content and the viewer's emotional response. But not everyone accepts that shield, and this is one of the most honest tensions in the show's entire history. To critics, particularly parents who found their children watching the cute animation, was not a mitigating factor, it was an aggravating one. It made the content look like something intended for children, when it was absolutely not. And it drew young viewers in precisely because it read as a children's show, aesthetically. Parker and Stone have always maintained that South Park is not made for children and should not be watched by them. But the visual language says otherwise, and that contradiction between stated audience and actual audience is real, and it does not have a clean resolution. This was the authentic controversy underneath all the surface controversies of the early years. Not whether specific words should be permitted on basic cable. Not whether specific religious figures could be depicted in specific ways. The deeper question was whether you could even make satire that looked like children's programming without bearing some responsibility for the children who would inevitably watch it. Parker and Stone's answer has always been, essentially, that they make what they make, and the responsibility for what children consume lies with the adults in their lives. Critics have never been entirely satisfied with that answer, and they are probably right not to be. But the argument has never been resolved, and it probably never will be. Meanwhile, the show was developing its own strange inner logic, its own rules about what comedy could do and how far it could go. Season 5's premiere episode, It Hits the Fan, aired in June of 2001 and was written entirely as a response to the media frenzy surrounding a character on the drama Chicago Hope, saying the word shit on network television. Parker's response was to write an episode where the same word was used 162 times, uncensored, displayed on screen with a running counter at the bottom, while also appearing in written form an additional 32 times. The total count was 194 uses of a single word in a single 22-minute episode. The reaction was approximately 5,000 complaining emails to Comedy Central. That is it. Relatively mild, all things considered. The episode made a specific point about language and cultural power. Its plot involved the idea that the uncensored use of a word could literally summon an ancient evil, a plague, medieval knights, genuine supernatural consequences. It was sophisticated social commentary about how language loses its power through overuse, delivered as an elaborate toilet joke. And that combination, the profound wrapped inside the profane, is what the show does at its very best. The headline is something that sounds outrageous. The actual episode is something you find yourself thinking about later. There is also a quieter controversy from this era that tends to get overlooked. The Columbine Connection. On the 20th of April 1999, the Columbine High School massacre happened in Littleton, Colorado. Matt Stone graduated from Heritage High School in Littleton, which is in the same school district as Columbine. Parker and Stone both had roots in the area and were deeply affected by what happened. In the wake of the shooting, there was an enormous cultural backlash against violent and offensive media. South Park, which had been on the air for less than 2 years and was already the most controversial animated program in America, suddenly existed in a completely different context. The criticism that the show might be corrupting young people had always been there. Now it carried a weight it had not previously carried. The show's feature film came out just 2 months after Columbine. Its entire plot, a moral panic over offensive entertainment, leading to the United States declaring war on Canada, had been written before the shooting. But the film's central argument, that blaming entertainment for violence is misguided and dangerous, landed in a cultural moment where millions of people were doing exactly that. Parker and Stone had to navigate whether releasing the film unchanged was brave or tone-deaf. They kept it unchanged. They were making the argument they had already made, and they were not going to walk it back because reality had become uncomfortable. What strikes me when I think about the Columbine connection is that it adds a genuine dimension of personal weight to what might otherwise look like pure provocateur behavior. Parker and Stone were not making this show from a comfortable distance, poking at things they had never personally encountered. They came from a community that had experienced one of the worst acts of mass violence in American history at that time. They understood, in a way that purely academic satirists could not, what real consequences felt like. And they kept making the show anyway. Not because they were reckless, because they believed and have consistently argued that comedy's job is not to stay silent in the face of tragedy. Its job is to process the thing, to hold it up, to refuse to let it be so large and so terrible that it cannot be examined at all. South Park has always been, underneath the crudeness, a show about the importance of being able to look at difficult things directly. It also explains something about why Parker and Stone reacted so strongly to Michael Moore's use of their aesthetic in Bowling for Columbine, the documentary that Moore made partly in response to the shooting. Stone participated in the film he spoke about, growing up in the Littleton area, about the social dynamics that might have contributed to the tragedy. And then Moore used a short animated segment, done in a style visually similar to South Park, immediately after Stone's interview, in a way that created the impression that Parker and Stone had produced it. They had not. The segment was made by someone else, without their involvement. Stone objected publicly, and specifically to Moore, having created a false impression. This was one of the relatively rare moments when Parker and Stone went on the offensive about someone else's use of controversy rather than defending their own. They were protective of their identity in ways that perhaps surprised people who thought of them as purely anarchic. You could be offended by their show. You could not misrepresent it. Section 4. The feature film fights the government. In June of 1999, South Park, bigger, longer, and uncut, arrived in theaters, and it brought with it one of the most sustained battles between creative artists and a regulatory body in the history of American cinema. Development had started in January of 1998, just as the show's first season was wrapping up. Parker and Stone signed a deal with Comedy Central that included both continuing the television series and producing a theatrical film. Their conditions were specific and non-negotiable. The movie had to receive at least an R rating, not PG-13. Not something that would compromise the show's essential nature. An R, at minimum. They wanted to go beyond what television allowed. Paramount Pictures, the distributor, initially pushed back. Executives asked whether Parker and Stone might consider aiming for PG-13 to maximize the audience and the box office potential. Parker and Stone declined immediately. Stone later told Entertainment Weekly that their intention was to spend Paramount's money building what amounted to an elaborate gesture of disrespect toward the MPAA, the Motion Picture Association of America. His exact words were that they were spending tons of Paramount's money to do a big middle finger to the MPAA. They were trying to offend the MPAA. And then they did exactly that. The MPAA gave the film an NC-17 rating. Not once. Not twice. The film was submitted and returned with an NC-17 6 times before it finally received an R rating after the 6th round of cuts and negotiations. 6. Parker and Stone spent months fighting for individual jokes, specific lines, particular images. Each round of MPAA review turning into a negotiation over what would and would not be permitted in a film whose entire theme was that censorship was hypocritical and destructive. The film was a genuine musical, not a parody of a musical, but an actual one, with original songs composed by Parker and Mark Shaman, that were structurally and musically legitimate Broadway-caliber pieces. It included a song called Uncle Something, in which a particular profanity was used 31 times. The complete film used that same word 139 times total. It earned a Guinness World Record in 2001 for the most profanity in an animated film, with 399 total swear words, 128 offensive gestures, and 221 acts of violence. And that specific number 399 was intentional. According to Parker and Stone, there was an understanding that 400 swear words would guarantee an NC-17 rating regardless of other factors. They stopped at 399 on purpose. Not because they ran out of profanity, because they were counting. There is also the matter of the title. The film was originally supposed to be called South Park. All Hell Breaks Loose. Parker and Stone have maintained that the MPAA rejected this title on the grounds that the word hell was unacceptable in a film's name. The MPAA disputes this account. Whatever the truth of that specific exchange, Parker and Stone's counterproposal was South Park, bigger, longer, and uncut, which is a triple entendre on the surface and a deeply specific anatomical joke underneath. And the MPAA approved it without hesitation. They rejected a word used in the Bible. They approved a reference to male anatomy. Parker and Stone pointed out this contradiction publicly, and then the film proceeded to spend 90 minutes making exactly that argument that American censorship is structurally incoherent, prioritizing prohibition of language while remaining tolerant of violence, punishing moral imagination while rewarding physical brutality. The film grossed $83 million worldwide against a production budget of $21 million. It was the highest-grossing rated animated film in history at that point, a record it held until 2016, when it was surpassed by another comedy aimed at adults. And the song Blame Canada received an Academy Award nomination for Best Original Song, which meant that on the night of the Oscars, Robin Williams performed a sanitized version of a South Park song on the most prestigious stage in American entertainment. South Park, which had been called everything from a cartoon from hell to a national embarrassment, was at the Oscars. Parker and Stone attended the ceremony, and they did so in dresses. Stone wore a replica of the lavender Versace gown Jennifer Lopez had worn to the Grammys. Parker wore a pink knockoff of the Gwyneth Paltrow dress from the previous year's ceremony. They had, by their own later admission, taken acid before the event. So there they were, the creators of one of the most controversial and profitable animated films ever made, at the Academy Awards, wearing formal gowns while experiencing psychedelic substances, representing a movie about animated children starting a war over profanity. And the Academy let them in. Because what were they going to do? These were the creators of one of the most commercially successful animated films in history. The dresses were just a bonus controversy. The MPAA's president at the time, Jack Valenti, later said publicly that he regretted granting the film an R rating and wished the NC-17 had been maintained. In response to the controversy, the MPAA actually expanded its rating system in 2000 to include detailed content descriptors alongside the letter ratings, the little explanations that now appear on movie posters, telling you that a film contains mild thematic elements, or strong language, or brief nudity. That system change was a direct response to bigger, longer, and uncut. A construction paper cartoon from Colorado changed how the American film rating system describes movies to audiences. That is a genuine and lasting institutional impact. There is also a brilliant piece of self-awareness in the film's entire structure that tends to get noted but not fully appreciated. The film is a musical. Specifically, it is a genuine Broadway-style musical with original songs written by Parker and composer Mark Shaman that hold up structurally and musically as real pieces of theatrical songwriting, not parodies of the form but actually part of the form. In 2011, Time magazine described the soundtrack as the finest, sassiest, full-movie musical score since the disbanding of the Freed unit at MGM. That is an extraordinary compliment for a film whose signature song includes the phrase, "Uncle Something," in its title. The choice to make it a musical was deliberate and loaded. In 1999, the musical was the dominant aesthetic of prestige animated filmmaking. This was the era of the Disney Renaissance, of films like The Lion King and The Little Mermaid, and Beauty and the Beast, all of which used big Broadway-style songs as their primary emotional language. By making Bigger, Longer, and Uncut into a genuine musical, Parker and Stone were not just borrowing the form for comedic effect. They were using the form against itself, deploying the aesthetic language of family-friendly animated storytelling in service of the most aggressively adult content they could construct. The form was the joke. The more genuinely good the songs were, and some of them are genuinely good, in the straightforward technical sense of well-structured, emotionally functional theatrical songwriting, the harder the content of the songs landed. A brilliantly composed song about profanity is funnier and more pointed than a badly composed one. Parker understood this intuitively. Robin Williams performed Blame Canada at the Academy Awards ceremony. Think about that sentence for a moment. Robin Williams, one of the most beloved performers in Hollywood history, at the Oscars, the most prestigious event in the American entertainment calendar, performing a song satirizing the tendency to blame Canada for American cultural failures. From a film about animated children starting a war, which had previously been submitted to the MPAA 6 times before being granted permission to exist, and the Academy had nominated it, and Williams performed it, and the world kept turning. And South Park kept making more episodes. Stone's comment about the MPAA being a bumbling, irresponsible organization has entered a kind of informal canon of statements about American cultural regulation. It was not just frustration speaking. It was an observation with a specific evidentiary basis the organization that had rated the film NC-17 multiple times had, as Stone pointed out, a historically inconsistent record when it came to the distinction between what it considered acceptable violence and what it considered acceptable language. Violence had always been treated more leniently than profanity in the American rating system. You could show a great deal of physical harm in a PG-13 film if you showed it in certain ways. But a certain number of uses of a particular word guaranteed a harder rating regardless of context. Bigger, Longer, and Uncut's entire argument was that this distinction was arbitrary and revealing that a society comfortable with simulated violence but not with language was making a choice about values, not just aesthetics, and that the choice was probably the wrong one. And the MPAA proved the argument by the specific nature of their objections. They were not concerned about the animated violence in the film, of which there was a significant amount. They were concerned about the language, particularly the word that appears 139 times. The society that was comfortable watching animated characters harm each other was not comfortable listening to them swear. Parker and Stone had designed their film as an argument about this double standard, and the MPAA then embodied the double standard in the process of evaluating the film. Life imitated art. Reality illustrated satire. The joke wrote itself. And the joke was true. Section 5. Scientology. Tom Cruise and the Heartbreak of Isaac Hayes. On the 16th of November 2005, South Park aired an episode called Trapped in the Closet. And it started what was probably the most tangled and emotionally complicated controversy in the show's history. The episode was written and directed by Trey Parker, who was credited under the pseudonym John Smith. The closing credits listed every named crew, cast, contributors as either John Smith or Jane Smith, in obvious anticipation of Scientology lawsuits. The joke is right there in the credits. In the episode, Stan Marsh takes a free Scientology personality test, is told his thetan levels are extraordinarily high, and is proclaimed to be the reincarnation of L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of the Church of Scientology. This brings Tom Cruise to Stan's house, who, after Stan tells him his movies are just okay, refuses to come out of Stan's closet. John Travolta arrives to coax him out. R. Kelly arrives and begins singing a parody of his own song Trapped in the Closet. At one point, Stan's father shouts the phrase that would immediately enter the cultural vocabulary. "Dad, Tom Cruise won't come out of the closet." The episode uses that ambiguity, being literally in a closet versus coming out of the closet, as both a structural joke and a specific reference to long-running public speculation about Cruise's personal life. Meanwhile, the actual theological beliefs of Scientology, the story of Xenu the Galactic Overlord, the volcanoes, the hydrogen bombs, the body thetans were presented on screen with complete seriousness, illustrated with detailed animation, accompanied by a caption at the bottom of the screen that read, "This is what Scientologists actually believe." No editorial comment, No mockery. Just the belief system. Presented neutrally, with a note confirming its factual accuracy. The joke was not that the beliefs were strange. The joke was that when you simply described the beliefs without any added commentary, the description is funnier than any parody could be. The episode received enormous critical acclaim. It has been rated 9.1 out of 10 on IMDb and consistently appears on lists of the greatest South Park episodes ever made. TV Guide ranked it number 17 on its list of the top 100 television episodes of all time, and the institutional fallout was immediate and significant. Matt Stone has explained in interviews that before this episode, virtually nobody in Hollywood would touch Scientology. The church was famously litigious, famously powerful, famously capable of making professional lives very difficult for people who criticized it publicly. Studios avoided the subject, journalists avoided it, network executives avoided it. South Park did not avoid it, and Parker described the impulse behind making the episode with characteristic honesty. He said that precisely because Scientology was known for suing people, the idea of poking at them with something legally and creatively bulletproof was enormously appealing. They wanted to see where the line was. They wanted to find out what you could and could not say about an organization that had spent decades making people afraid to say anything at all. The closing credits of the episode, where every name was listed as either John Smith or Jane Smith, is one of the more elegant pieces of legal preemption in television history. Parker and Stone were not just protecting their crew from potential litigation, they were making the protection itself into a joke, into a visible, public acknowledgement of exactly the dynamic they were satirizing. The Scientologists would have to sue John Smith and Jane Smith. The absurdity of that legal scenario was part of the comedy. And it worked, in the sense that no successful legal action was ever brought against the show over the episode's content. The day after the episode aired, the 17th of November 2005, a high-ranking Scientology executive named Mike Rinder wrote a detailed memo to the church's leader, David Miscavige, outlining how the organization intended to respond. This memo was later made public after Rinder left the church and became one of its most prominent critics. The memo outlined a coordinated response strategy, investigating the show's creators, looking for vulnerabilities, considering legal options, and managing the church's public profile in response to the episode. It was a memo about how to fight back against a cartoon, written by someone whose job was to manage global crises for one of the world's wealthiest and most litigious private organizations. And it did not work. The episode aired. The episode stayed in rotation. The episode eventually received an Emmy nomination. The church's legal case, as its own lawyers eventually concluded, was too weak to pursue. What Trapped in the Closet revealed about Scientology, not the theology, which was common knowledge in certain circles, but the operational behavior, the reflex toward litigation, the pattern of pressuring affiliated individuals was probably more damaging to the organization's public image than any single piece of investigative journalism that had previously been published. Because comedy reaches people that journalism does not. Because a joke that makes you laugh takes you by surprise in a way that an article never can. And because once you have laughed at something, it is very hard to be afraid of it in the way you were before. South Park's contribution to the public understanding of Scientology is, in retrospect, significant and probably underestimated. The episode aired in 2005. In the years following it, journalistic and documentary investigations of the church increased substantially. Former members became more willing to speak publicly. The church's public profile as an organization became more complicated in ways that were partly attributable to the cultural permission that Trapped in the Closet provided the permission to treat the institution as a subject of scrutiny rather than a subject of fear. The response came in the form of what the media called Closet Gate. The episode was scheduled for a rebroadcast on the 15th of March, 2006. But Comedy Central pulled it at the last minute and replaced it with a rerun of an older episode, Chef's Chocolate Salty Balls from Season 2. The network claimed the change was a tribute to Isaac Hayes, who had just announced his departure from the show. Multiple media outlets reported a different explanation. Tom Cruise had allegedly threatened to boycott the promotional tour for Mission Impossible 3, which was being distributed by Paramount Pictures, which was owned by Viacom, which also owned Comedy Central. The implication was that a corporate parent had been asked to choose between protecting a $45 million film campaign and broadcasting a 22-minute cartoon. The cartoon lost. Parker and Stone issued a statement through their lawyer, which they signed as Trey Parker and Matt Stone, servants of the Dark Lord Xenu. But the deeper story, and the one that has haunted the controversy ever since, is what actually happened to Isaac Hayes. Hayes had voiced the character of Chef since the show's very first episode in August of 1997. He was not just a voice actor. He was genuinely beloved. Chef was one of the most iconic secondary characters the show had ever produced. The warm, wise, occasionally inappropriate school cafeteria cook who sang R&B songs to children about the complexities of adult life. Hayes was a Scientologist himself. He had been a member of the church since the 1990s. And in March of 2006, a press release went out in his name, announcing that he was leaving South Park. The statement said, and these are nearly direct words, "There is a place in this world for satire, but there is a time when satire ends and intolerance and bigotry toward religious beliefs of others begins. Religious beliefs are sacred to people and at all times should be respected and honored. Note the similarity in language to how the church itself described the episode. Satire has a place in society, but there are limits." The phrasing is strikingly similar because, as it turned out, the two statements had essentially the same source. Matt Stone's response was blunt and honest. He said this was entirely about Hayes' faith in Scientology. He noted that Hayes had spent years participating in a show that made fun of Christians, Jews, Muslims, Mormons, and every other religious tradition, and had cashed plenty of checks along the way, without ever raising this objection before. Stone said the line about religious beliefs being sacred was remarkably selective, coming from someone who had worked on South Park for 9 years. But here is the truth that did not come out until much later, told publicly by Hayes' son, Isaac Hayes III, in a 2016 interview with The Hollywood Reporter. In January of 2006, shortly after the Trapped in the Closet episode aired, Isaac Hayes suffered a stroke, a serious one. He lost the ability to speak. He was in no condition to make independent decisions, to manage his career, or to issue public statements. The people around him at the time, his assistants, his publicists, the core group of people in his immediate circle were, essentially all of them, Scientologists. And someone in that circle made the decision to quit South Park on Isaac Hayes' behalf and issued the press release in his name. Isaac Hayes III has been consistent about this for years. His father did not quit South Park. Scientology quit South Park for him. Matt Stone confirmed that this is what he and Parker eventually came to believe had happened. Hayes never got to speak for himself. He never recovered his voice or his full cognitive function. He died on the 10th of August, 2008, from another stroke, at the age of 65, having never fully regained his capacity for independent expression. The real story of his departure did not become public until 8 years after he left. Think about what this means as a human story, separate from any question of the show's content or the church's behavior. A man who loved his work, who loved connecting with fans, who had been given a creative second act by this show after years in which his career had been less visible, was separated from that work by people who were supposed to be protecting him. He never got to say goodbye. He never got to decide, with his own mind and in his own words, whether he wanted to leave or stay. Trey and Matt never got to reconcile with him, never got to work through whatever they might have worked through, because by the time they understood what had actually happened, Hayes was gone. Parker and Stone dedicated the season 12 episode, The China Program, to his memory. The response to Hayes' announced departure, before anyone knew the truth, was swift and unsparing. Just days after the press release, Parker and Stone aired an episode called The Return of Chef, in which the character is depicted as having been brainwashed by a cult called the Super Adventure Club, an obvious stand-in for Scientology. Old audio from Hayes' previous appearances was spliced and rearranged into new dialogue, making the character say things Hayes had never actually said in that context. The episode ended with Chef dying in an extraordinarily graphic fashion, mauled and burned and impaled, before being resurrected as a sinister robotic version of his former self. It was simultaneously a farewell to the character, a pointed statement about Scientology, and viewed in the light of what we now know a tragically misdirected response to a situation that was far more complicated and far more sad than anyone understood at the time. Section 6. The Prophet and the Black Screen. The thread that eventually became the most consequential controversy in South Park's history began very quietly on the 4th of July 2001, with an episode that generated almost no reaction at all. Super Best Friends was the third episode of Season 5. In it, the boys get involved with a David Blaine cult, and a team of religious superhero figures is assembled to deal with the threat. Jesus, Buddha, Moses, Krishna, Joseph Smith, and Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, depicted on screen with fire-based superpowers, treated with the same irreverence and the same basic respect as every other religious figure on the show. Muhammad was a character, he had a design, he was heroic, he was positive, he was part of the team, he appeared in the opening title sequence among the crowd of characters in the background. Nobody noticed, nobody complained, no death threats, no boycotts, no calls for cancellation. The episode aired, people watched it, and life went on. Remember that date, the 4th of July 2001, 9 weeks before September 11. Because that is when the world changed. And when the episode that had aired without incident became retroactively dangerous, not because anything in it had changed, but because the cultural context had transformed completely around it. After 2001, the question of depicting the Prophet of Islam in visual media became one of the most charged and volatile subjects in global culture. And then, in September of 2005, a Danish newspaper called Jyllands-Posten published 12 editorial cartoons depicting Muhammad. Some of the cartoons were offensive in their content. Others were relatively innocuous. All of them were deemed blasphemous by significant portions of the Muslim world. The response was global and violent in a way that the editors of a Danish newspaper probably did not anticipate. Riots broke out across the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Asia. Embassies were attacked and some set on fire. More than 100 people died in protests and the violence surrounding them. Cartoonists and journalists received death threats and went into hiding. The world's understanding of the risks attached to depicting Muhammad in any visual form changed fundamentally and permanently. South Park first addressed this directly in 2006 with the two-part Season 10 episodes known as the Cartoon Wars. These aired on April 5 and April 12 of that year. The premise was that Family Guy had announced an upcoming episode that would depict Muhammad as a character. Muslim extremists threatened retaliation. The town of South Park panics. Cartman, who despises Family Guy for his own entirely unrelated reasons, teams up with forces, trying to have the episode censored. Kyle fights to have it broadcast uncensored. The episode was simultaneously a genuine meditation on censorship and fear, a vicious parody of Family Guy's writing style, and a meta-commentary on South Park's own position within the debate. Parker and Stone had wanted to make an episode centered on Muhammad for months before the Danish cartoon controversy even erupted. When they brought the idea to Comedy Central, the network's response was immediate discomfort. The executives told them repeatedly they were not going to broadcast an episode about Muhammad. Parker and Stone responded that they absolutely had the right not to, that it was their network, but that they were going to make the episode regardless, and that it would be one of the 7 episodes they were contracted to deliver that season. This standoff became the engine of the Cartoon Wars episodes themselves. The argument Parker and Stone were having with Comedy Central in real life became the argument Kyle was having with the fictional Fox network president in the show, with Kyle's dialogue drawn almost verbatim from the conversations Parker and Stone were actually having. It is an extraordinary piece of television, not just because of what it argues, but because of how it argues it. Parker and Stone did not make an episode that criticized censorship in the abstract. They made an episode that described their specific situation, their specific negotiations, their specific frustrations, and embedded it inside a story about other people's specific situation so that the audience was watching something simultaneously fictional and entirely real, without being able to cleanly separate the two layers. The show was not just commenting on the ethics of free expression, it was demonstrating them in real time by choosing to have the argument in public rather than in private. The genius of what Parker and Stone built here is that the episodes function on multiple levels at the same time. On one level, they are about the fictional scenario what happens when fear dictates artistic choice. On another level, they are about Parker and Stone's real conflict with Comedy Central, which had been telling them they could not depict Muhammad in the episode. Kyle's impassioned speech to the fictional Fox network president, arguing that the choice to censor the image was capitulation to extremist pressure and a betrayal of free expression, was drawn almost word for word from conversations Parker and Stone had been having with actual Comedy Central executives. Parker later said that the character of Kyle was essentially him in those arguments, with Stone's position also folded in, making the case in a half hour of television that they had been making in production meetings. And then the show within the show made its choice. The fictional Family Guy episode aired the Muhammad scene. He appeared on screen. He walked across the frame. He handed Peter Griffin a football helmet. Nothing bad happened. No one was hurt. The world did not end. The fictional show within the show proved the point. And then Comedy Central, in broadcasting the real show that contained this scene, cut to a black screen. The caption read, "Comedy Central has refused to broadcast an image of Muhammad on their network." The network censored the show about network censorship at precisely the moment that illustrated the show's central argument. The fiction and the reality folded into each other perfectly. The episode was satirizing censorship, driven by fear. Comedy Central demonstrated censorship driven by fear at the exact moment the satire was describing it. Parker and Stone had written a self-fulfilling prophecy, and they did not even have to be surprised by it. Comedy Central then allowed Parker and Stone to broadcast, in the same episode, a scene where Jesus Christ defecates on President George W. Bush and the American flag. Jesus, depicted performing one of the most deliberately degrading acts imaginable, on the head of state of the United States of America, and on the national symbol that made the broadcast. Muhammad handing someone a football helmet that did not. Comedy Central later acknowledged honestly that the reason was not about religious sensitivity. It was about safety. They did not want their offices bombed. And Parker and Stone, who were clearly frustrated, had to acknowledge that this was at least an honest answer, even if it was not one they could accept. What Parker has said in retrospect about the Cartoon Wars episodes is illuminating and a little heartbreaking. He said that his biggest regret about those two episodes was not the censorship itself. It was that the public conversation about the episodes focused almost entirely on the feud between South Park and Family Guy, on the inter-show drama, on the comedy competition between two animated series, rather than on the actual substance of the argument. Whether fear should be allowed to determine what can and cannot be depicted in a free society. People were more interested in which show was funnier than in whether the principle of free expression was being meaningfully upheld or meaningfully abandoned. Parker said this was, in its way, the most depressing outcome, not the censorship, the indifference to the significance of the censorship. And he is right. That indifference is itself a form of surrender. If the public conversation about an episode arguing that free speech matters ends up being primarily about which animated show has better writing, then the censorship has worked. It has redirected the attention. It has made the noise louder than the signal. And the show found itself in the strange position of having been simultaneously brave and unheard, of having made a serious argument and had it received as entertainment gossip. Both Cartoon Wars episodes are now among the 5 South Park episodes that cannot be legally streamed anywhere. They are effectively missing from the official record of the show, accessible only through unofficial means. An episode about censorship has been censored. An argument that fear should not dictate creative choices was silenced by fear. The irony is complete, and it remains unresolved. Section 7. Episodes 200 and 201 Death Threats and the Censored Speech, the 14th of April 2010. South Park aired its 200th episode, and Trey Parker and Matt Stone decided to celebrate by making the single most consequential episode in the show's history. To mark the milestone, they brought back essentially every celebrity who had ever been mocked in South Park's 13 years on television. Tom Cruise, Barbra Streisand, Mel Gibson, Kanye West, and dozens of others, and had them file a class action lawsuit against the town of South Park for defamation and ridicule. Tom Cruise organizes the effort. The celebrities' demand is simple. They want the town to bring them the Prophet Muhammad, because Muhammad apparently possesses a unique and extraordinary power. He is the only person in the world who cannot be ridiculed. He is immune to satire, and Tom Cruise wants that immunity. The episode was brilliant, funny, dense with callbacks and Easter eggs and references to 13 years of the show's history. Muhammad appeared in it, but was always concealed behind a black censored bar, inside a U-Haul truck, inside a large bear costume. Parker and Stone were pushing right up to the edge of the line without crossing it, because they knew what crossing it might trigger, and because the joke about the concealment was itself the joke. You could not see the thing. The thing you could not see was the source of the power. The inability to look was the point. Between the broadcast of episode 200 on April 14 and the planned broadcast of episode 201 on April 21, a website called revolutionmuslim.com posted a message. The organization behind it was a New York-based Islamist group, and the message was addressed to Parker and Stone directly. It warned them that they risked being murdered for what they were doing. It included a photograph of Theo van Gogh, the Dutch filmmaker, who had been stabbed and shot to death in Amsterdam in 2004 for making a short film about the treatment of women in some Muslim societies. It included the physical addresses of Comedy Central's offices in New York and Los Angeles. The author of the post insisted it was not a threat, but a warning of what was likely to happen to them. The New York City Police Department increased security at Comedy Central's headquarters in direct response. The FBI opened an investigation. Parker and Stone were provided with security details. For a period of weeks, two of the most successful comedy writers in America were walking around with professional protection because they had made a cartoon. Episode 201 aired on the 21st of April 2010. And it aired in a form that Parker and Stone had not approved and did not know about until it broadcast. Without consulting the creators, Comedy Central had inserted audio bleeps over every single spoken reference to Muhammad's name in the episode. They had censored multiple additional lines of dialogue. And they had censored almost the entirety of the episode's final 3 consecutive speeches, delivered by Kyle, by Jesus, and by Santa Claus, which contained the moral of the episode. The speeches were about how violence and the threat of violence should not be used to suppress free expression. Comedy Central censored a speech about censorship. In response to threats of violence, they demonstrated that threats of violence work. Parker and Stone were furious. South Park Studios posted a statement immediately after the episode aired confirming that Comedy Central had inserted numerous additional bleeps and edits without the creators' permission. The episode that had broadcast was not the episode they had made. Comedy Central later confirmed, through a spokesperson, that yes, they had inserted the bleeps. The spokesperson said they could not comment on the thinking behind the decision, but confirmed that it was Comedy Central, not South Park, that had made the changes. Jon Stewart devoted 10 minutes of The Daily Show the following night to the controversy, expressing his disgust at Revolution Muslim and telling them, in song and in no uncertain terms, precisely what they could do with themselves. Bill Maher said the threats demonstrated exactly why the First Amendment existed and why it needed defending. Senator Joe Lieberman publicly criticized Revolution Muslim's behavior, and Zachary Adam Chesser, the man who had written the threatening post on Revolution Muslim's website, was arrested in July of 2010, not primarily for the South Park threats, but for attempting to provide material support to Al-Shabaab, a Somali terrorist organization. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Another member of the organization, Jesse Morton, was also arrested and sentenced to 11.5 years. The 2 episodes, 200 and 201, were pulled from Comedy Central's website, removed from streaming platforms, excluded from syndication packages, and physically absent from certain DVD and Blu-ray releases, even when the packaging claimed that all episodes were included. Super Best Friends, the 2001 episode that had aired in July of that year without a single complaint, was also pulled from circulation because it depicted Muhammad, even though in 2001, nobody had raised any objection to that depiction at all. It became a banned episode retroactively not because of anything it had done wrong, but because the world had changed around it. In the audio commentaries for episodes 200 and 201, Parker and Stone are, for the first time in the show's history, essentially silent. Parker notes at the opening that they had done the episode as intended and sent it in. Then a lengthy bleep obscures the remainder of his comment, Stone says, "Yeah, that's pretty much it." For the only time in 20-plus years of commentary tracks, Parker and Stone had nothing more to say. Not because they had run out of things to think, because there were things they could not say. Even in the behind-the-scenes material, the censorship reached. Think about what Kyle's censored speech was arguing, that the town's willingness to give in to intimidation would only invite more intimidation, that capitulating to fear would validate the use of fear as a tool, that the correct response to a threat is not compliance, but defiance. Comedy Central censored that argument. And in censoring it, they proved it correct. The message that threats work was delivered by the fact of the censorship itself. Kyle's argument was vindicated at the moment it was silenced. The broader aftermath of episodes 200 and 201 played out over years, not weeks. When South Park eventually migrated to streaming platforms, the 5 Muhammad-related episodes were simply not included. For audiences who had never seen them, they were as if they did not exist. For audiences who had seen them when they originally aired, they were memories with no official record attached to them. The episodes existed in private collections, on hard drives, on unofficial archive sites, and in the memories of people who had been watching when they first broadcast. But through any official channel, any channel with a legal, commercial relationship to the show, they were gone. Parker later spoke in interviews about the emotional toll of the entire 200 over 201 situation, in a way that was unusually candid for someone who rarely admits to being affected by anything. He described the period as genuinely frightening in a way that was different from any previous controversy the show had faced. Previous controversies had involved people being angry, or institutions threatening legal action, or corporate pressure to change creative decisions. This was different. This was the specific particular fear of physical violence directed at specific people, at him personally, and at Stone personally, and at the building where they worked. Walking to your car, looking over your shoulder. Having people whose job is to stand between you and potential harm standing next to you in the coffee shop, the parking lot, the grocery store. And the remarkable thing, the thing that deserves to be said clearly, is that after all of it, they went back to work. They finished the season. They made more episodes. They continued being, in every essential respect, exactly the same show they had always been. The security detail ended eventually. The FBI investigation ran its course. Zachary Chesser went to prison. And Parker and Stone were still there, in the writer's room, with the blank page and the 6-day deadline and the mandate to make something that mattered. You can be brave from a position of safety. What they demonstrated after 200 and 201 was the capacity to continue being controversial from a position of genuine, documented, federally acknowledged personal risk. That is a harder thing than it looks, and it does not get acknowledged enough. Section 8. Banned in China taking on a superpower. On the 2nd of October 2019, South Park aired what might be the most geopolitically significant episode in the show's entire 28-year run. It was the second episode of Season 23, the 299th episode of the series overall, and it was called Banned in China. The episode had been timed with uncanny precision, though Parker and Stone have always maintained the timing was not entirely deliberate. The NBA story broke the same week the episode was already being made, and the convergence was one of those moments where the show's 6-day production cycle turned a coincidence into something that looked like prophecy. But the content itself was clearly intentional. Parker and Stone had been watching Hollywood's relationship with China with increasing frustration for years, watching studios recut films, remove dialogue, alter storylines, digitally edit maps to include disputed territorial claims, and in at least one documented case, film sequences in a province where human rights organizations were documenting mass internment, all in pursuit of access to the Chinese box office. The episode directly called out Hollywood studios, the NBA, Disney, Marvel, and essentially every American corporation that had been quietly editing its content, removing references to Taiwan, erasing Tibetan culture, scrubbing acknowledgments of Chinese human rights issues, and generally compromising its creative and moral integrity in exchange for access to a market of 1.4 billion consumers. The line that became instantly, unavoidably iconic was delivered with Randy's typical cheerful pragmatism. You gotta lower your ideals of freedom if you want to suck on the warm teat of China. It was blunt, it was crude, and it was exactly right. It crystallized something that a lot of people had been watching happen for years without anyone in a position of cultural authority being willing to say it plainly. Within days of the episode's broadcast, South Park disappeared from the Chinese internet. Every clip, every episode, every fan discussion, every Weibo post, every Baidu thread, every entry on Alibaba's streaming service Youku gone. A search of Weibo, which contains billions of posts, returned 0 results for South Park. The Chinese government had erased a 20-year library of content from the most populous country on Earth in what appeared to be less than a week. If you tried to access the former South Park thread on Baidu's discussion platform, a message appeared that read, "According to the relevant law and regulation, this section is temporarily not open." The show had been banned by an authoritarian government with extraordinary control over its domestic internet infrastructure. And the government had done it in response to a cartoon about the fact that authoritarian governments have extraordinary control over their domestic internet infrastructure. The irony was as large as the country it was happening in. Parker and Stone's response was released as a formal statement 5 days after the episode aired, on the 7th of October 2019. It read, in full, "Like the NBA, we welcome the Chinese censors into our homes and into our hearts. We too love money more than freedom and democracy. She doesn't look just like Winnie the Pooh at all. Tune into our 300th episode this Wednesday at 10. Long live the great Communist Party of China. May this autumn's sorghum harvest be bountiful. We good now, China?" That statement is perfect. It is sarcastic, it is funny, it is specific, and it is completely free of fear. It referenced the NBA controversy that was consuming sports media at exactly that moment. Houston Rockets general manager Daryl Morey had tweeted support for Hong Kong's pro-democracy protesters, and the NBA had scrambled to contain the damage to its Chinese business relationships, with Chinese broadcasters pulling Rockets games and Chinese sponsors withdrawing. The league's response had been widely criticized as a betrayal of its stated values. Parker and Stone wrote their mock apology in the voice of exactly that kind of capitulation, and the contrast between the organization's genuflecting and the construction paper cartoon that absolutely would not made the point more clearly than any editorial could have. Bloomberg News later reported that Apple, which had significant manufacturing operations and user bases in China, was unlikely to bid for South Park's streaming rights as a result of the ban. The show's defiance was affecting its business prospects in real and measurable ways, and Parker and Stone clearly did not care. The following episode continued the China critique. A subsequent episode parodied LeBron James amid the ongoing NBA China controversy. The ban remained. The mock apologies continued. The sorghum harvest remained bountiful. What is particularly worth noting is how the China ban affected something larger than just South Park's availability in one market. Bloomberg reporting on Apple's reluctance to pursue streaming rights. The ongoing media coverage of what it meant for an American entertainment property to be completely scrubbed from Chinese digital infrastructure. Congressional interest in how American companies were managing their relationship with Chinese regulatory demands. These were not entertainment industry conversations. These were conversations about geopolitics, about the proper relationship between American corporations and authoritarian governments, about whether market access was being traded for something more valuable than revenue. Banned in China did not create these conversations on its own, but it gave them a sharp, specific, funny, and inarguable example that made them accessible to people who had not been following the policy debates. That is what the best political satire does. It takes something complicated and makes it concrete. It gives people a way to understand the thing. Consider what this represents in the larger context of the show's history. South Park has upset parents. It has upset religious organizations. It has upset individual celebrities and their lawyers. It has upset corporate networks and their standards departments. But banned in China was the show taking on one of the most powerful governments on Earth, and then, when that government responded with the full force of its internet censorship apparatus, responding with a joke about the autumn harvest. That is a different thing than any previous controversy. That is a different scale of defiance. Section 9. The Trump Era Season 27. And the White House Strikes Back. On the 23rd of July 2025, South Park returned after a 2-year hiatus. The circumstances surrounding the return were themselves remarkable. Less than 24 hours before the premiere, Trey Parker and Matt Stone had signed a new deal with Paramount, valued at $1.5 billion, covering 50 new episodes and giving Paramount Plus exclusive streaming rights to the show's entire library. $1.5 billion. For a cartoon made in a style that resembles construction paper. For a show whose two creators still essentially voice the majority of the characters themselves. The episode that aired that night was called Sermon on the Mount. It was the 329th episode of the series, and it was the first South Park episode to directly depict Donald Trump as a character rather than working around him through surrogates. For years, Parker and Stone had used the character of Mr. Garrison as a Trump stand-in. They had explained this choice in various interviews. Trump was simply too absurd to parody. He was already a cartoon. Making a cartoon of a cartoon was redundant. Stone had told a journalist at one point that Trump was essentially already South Park. So they worked around the problem by making Garrison into a Trump-adjacent figure while declining to put the actual person in the show. That era ended with Sermon on the Mount, and it ended decisively. The episode depicted Trump in the same visual style that the show had used for Saddam Hussein in its 1999 film, animated in South Park's cutout aesthetic, recognizable but abstracted. Trump was depicted in a sexual relationship with Satan, echoing precisely the relationship between Satan and Saddam Hussein that the show had explored in the late 90s, and then continued in various forms throughout its run. In one scene, Trump is in the White House bedroom, getting into bed with Satan, asking him for intimacy after what he describes as a long day of work. Satan declines. Trump pulls down the blanket. A comically small anatomical feature is revealed. Satan says he cannot even see anything. The scene continued from there. The episode also included a deepfake-assisted sequence produced using Parker and Stone's AI company Deep Voodoo, showing a live-action rendering of Trump wandering through a desert, removing his clothing until he is naked except for his shoes and socks, in what was framed as a pro-Trump public service announcement that the town of South Park had been required to produce as part of settling a $5 billion lawsuit the president had filed against them. Jesus appeared at South Park Elementary as a guidance counselor, but only because Paramount had made a deal with Trump and he was contractually required to be there. The episode referenced the Paramount settlement over a 60 Minutes lawsuit. It referenced the Jeffrey Epstein files. It referenced the cancellation of Stephen Colbert's Late Show, which had been dropped by CBS, a Paramount property, in circumstances that many observers connected to the Trump administration's pressure on media companies. There is a remarkable behind-the-scenes detail about the episode's production that Parker shared publicly. During the making of the PSA sequence, the question arose of whether Trump's anatomical feature depicted as comically small needed to be blurred for broadcast standards. Paramount's production team told Parker that yes, it probably needed to be blurred. Parker's response was to have the animators give the feature eyes, turning it into a character, at which point it technically qualified as a character rather than an anatomical depiction, and therefore did not require blurring under the applicable standards. Parker said the internal conversation about this lasted for 4 days. 4 days of production time on a show, with a 6-day total production cycle, were consumed by the question of how to keep a presidential genital joke in the episode without triggering censorship requirements. They found a way. Of course they found a way. The episode went through multiple layers of corporate review that were themselves unusual for South Park. Paramount Global Standards and Practices Department reviewed it. Executive producer Ann Garofino reviewed it. Paramount's COO reviewed it. The co-CEOs of Paramount reviewed it and then asked Parker and Stone to describe it to the company's controlling shareholder, Shari Redstone, who had not seen the episode but trusted the co-CEOs' judgment and allowed it to proceed. The future CEO, David Ellison, was told before air that the episode would be, in the description offered to him, disparaging to Donald Trump. He was apparently not surprised by this information, which suggests that when Paramount signed a $1.5 billion deal with Parker and Stone, they understood with complete clarity what they were signing. The episode then aired on Comedy Central and immediately became #1 on Paramount Plus as word spread about its content. Cross-platform, The ratings for the premiere were described as a record high since 1999. Nearly 6 million viewers across all platforms in the first few days. Within 24 hours of the premiere, the White House issued an official response. The statement came from White House spokesperson Taylor Rogers and was released to multiple entertainment publications. It read, in part, "The left's hypocrisy truly has no end. For years they have come after South Park for what they labeled as offensive content. But suddenly, they are praising the show. Just like the creators of South Park, the left has no authentic or original content, which is why their popularity continues to hit record lows. This show hasn't been relevant for over 20 years and is hanging on by a thread with uninspired ideas in a desperate attempt for attention. President Trump has delivered on more promises in just 6 months than any other president in our country's history, and no fourth-rate show can derail President Trump's hot streak. Fourth-rate. Irrelevant. Hanging by a thread. The White House of the United States of America issued an official press release about a construction paper cartoon. There are so many things worth noting about this press release. The first is the most obvious. The White House issued it at all. If the show were genuinely irrelevant and genuinely hanging by a thread, the communications staff of the executive branch of the United States government would not spend any of their time or political capital commenting on it. You do not dedicate official government bandwidth to things that do not matter. The press release is itself evidence that the show matters, issued by an administration that wanted to argue it does not. The internal contradiction is visible, and it was visible to everyone who read the statement, including the journalists who covered it and the viewers who went looking for the episode afterward. The second thing worth noting is the language. The statement accused the show of lacking original content. The show being described as lacking original content was, at the moment of the statement's release, a program that had just done something no television show had previously done. Depicted a sitting American president in a sexual relationship with Satan as its very first act after a 2-year hiatus. In an episode that also referenced a specific ongoing legal dispute between that president and the company that owns the network, embedded inside a storyline about the president forcing Jesus to work in an elementary school as part of a lawsuit settlement. Whatever South Park is, it is not unoriginal. The following day, Trey Parker appeared at San Diego Comic-Con. He was asked by a reporter to respond to the White House's condemnation of the show. Parker paused. He looked at the camera. He said, in the flattest, most deadpan voice imaginable, "We're terribly sorry." And then he held the stare for approximately 5 seconds, expressionless, until the room erupted. It was the same move they had made with China in 2019. Someone with enormous institutional power told them to stop, and they apologized in exactly the way that made it unmistakably clear they were not going to stop. The mock apology had become the show's signature response to authority, not defiance in the angry, raised fist sense. Something more deflating than that. A politeness so exaggerated it becomes its own form of contempt. The second episode of Season 27 grew to 6.2 million global multi-platform viewers in its first 3 days. The White House called the show irrelevant. The show responded by posting its highest numbers in years. This is the feedback loop that has sustained South Park for nearly 3 decades. Outrage as advertisement, condemnation as endorsement, the powerful making the show more powerful every time they try to diminish it. Trey Parker, in a later interview with the New York Times, explained the shift in the show's political focus with a line that deserves to be quoted carefully. He said that politics had become pop culture, not that South Park had gotten more political, that politics had become the subject that consumed all other subjects, the lens through which every other piece of culture was now being read. You could not make an episode about literally anything without it being read as a political statement, because everything had become political. The show had not moved toward politics. Politics had moved toward the show. Section 10. Season 28. And the Ongoing War, a show that will not stop. Season 28 premiered on the 15th of October 2025, as a direct continuation of the storyline that Season 27 had built. The Trump-Satan relationship, established in Sermon on the Mount, had developed through the intervening episodes into a full romantic plotline, complete with a pregnancy. Satan was carrying Trump's child, an event described within the show's universe as the potential birth of an Antichrist, and the season's arc concerned itself with what both figures intended to do about that. The choice to make Satan the more sympathetic character in this relationship was not accidental or arbitrary. It was a specific creative decision that worked on multiple levels. Satan, in South Park's mythology going back to the 1999 film and its various depictions across the show's history, has always been characterized as someone with genuine emotional needs, someone who wants connection, who is capable of vulnerability, who can be hurt. Trump, in the show's portrayal, lacks these qualities entirely. He is interested in Satan only insofar as Satan serves his purposes. When those purposes are no longer served, he moves on without apparent remorse. This dynamic made Satan, the literal embodiment of evil in traditional theology, into the figure the audience was rooting for. Parker and Stone had done this kind of moral inversion before, but never quite so sustainedly across a full two-season arc. The show depicted J.D. Vance as Trump's subordinate and occasional romantic rival, and Vance's response to seeing himself portrayed on South Park was, in its own way, a small cultural moment. He posted on the social media platform X that he had finally made it. It was a graceful acknowledgement. Here is a sitting Vice President of the United States treating his South Park parody as a rite of passage, which in a sense it is. Getting mocked on South Park means you have achieved a specific kind of cultural weight. The show does not bother with people who do not matter. Being fourth-rate and irrelevant would actually protect you from it. The second episode of Season 27 depicted Kristi Noem, the Secretary of Homeland Security, going on a puppy-killing rampage, a direct reference to her autobiography's admission that she had shot her family's dog. Pete Hegseth appeared and was jailed. Peter Thiel appeared as an Antichrist expert. The Jeffrey Epstein connection wove through multiple episodes. Jesus became a full MAGA supporter, eventually revealing himself on the side of Trump in the season finale. Before reconsidering, Satan, throughout the arc, was positioned as the more sympathetic figure, the one with genuine emotional investment, the one who wanted accountability, the one who kept being left behind by someone who was using him. Something worth noting about the political context of Season 27 and 28 is that Parker and Stone were making these episodes at a moment when a lot of other voices in American entertainment had gone quiet. The first half of 2025 had been, by various accounts, characterized by a notable silence from people who would normally be expected to comment on political developments: comedians, late-night hosts, journalists, executives who had previously been outspoken. The chilling effect of aggressive legal action, the cancellation of programs, the settlement of lawsuits under circumstances that suggested pressure rather than legal merit, all of this had created an atmosphere in which saying things about the people in power carried more risk than it had previously carried. South Park walked into this atmosphere and said what it said. The ratings response suggests that there was a significant audience for someone saying the thing, for someone not managing their message, for someone treating the situation with the irreverence it had always been treated with on this show. Whether you agreed with the specific political positions or not, there was something in the sheer persistence of it, in the refusal to be quieted by the same mechanisms that had quieted others that resonated. In the finale, the Antichrist baby died by suicide in the womb before birth, which is probably the darkest joke the show has ever committed to a season-long arc. Trump celebrated the news. Satan packed his things and left the White House, and the show, as it always does, reset for the next season. The season drew multiple additional condemnations from White House representatives. Each new press release generated additional media coverage. Each burst of media coverage brought new viewers to the episodes. The pattern held perfectly, as it has held for 28 years. An administration source told Deadline Hollywood that Trump was, in their words, seething over the childish attack. But Trump himself said nothing publicly, which those familiar with his social media habits found notable. The speculation was that he had decided this was a battle he could not win, that engaging directly would only amplify the show's reach, and had chosen silence as the more strategic option. Whether or not that calculation was deliberate, it was probably correct. The White House's official responses, with their talk of fourth-rate shows hanging by threads, had demonstrably increased viewership. More direct presidential engagement would likely have sent ratings even higher. The Season 28 finale, called The Crap Out and broadcast in December of 2025, closed out the two-season Trump arc with a characteristic South Park gesture. an ending that resolved the central storyline while refusing to provide a satisfying moral conclusion. The Antichrist was not born. Satan was left alone with his grief. Trump went back to doing whatever Trump does. Stan got his family's house back. As a sort of Christmas miracle. Because the show has always had a soft spot for Christmas, and always will. Jesus realized he had been acting selfishly, and corrected himself, at least partially. The woodland creatures, the evil ones, from the classic holiday episodes, returned as plot participants. It was complicated, dense, occasionally moving, and deliberately unsatisfying in the way that South Park's best endings always are. Life continues. Nothing is resolved. The next controversy is already being written. The total viewership across seasons 27 and 28 represented the highest sustained ratings the show had produced since the late 1990s. The show that the White House called irrelevant finished 2025 as one of the most watched cable programs in the country. Parker and Stone had signed a $1.5 billion deal and immediately made an episode designed to get themselves in trouble with the entity whose goodwill their corporate parent most needed. And Paramount had approved it. Because, and this is the most important business insight in the show's entire history, Paramount understood that the controversy is the product. You are not paying $1.5 billion for a polite cartoon. You are paying it for a controversial one. The controversy is the point. Section 11. The escalation curve. How the stakes kept growing. When you lay out South Park's conflict with authority in chronological order, a specific pattern becomes visible. The controversies did not repeat. They escalated. Each new conflict operated at a higher level of consequence than the one before it. In 1997 and 1998, the controversies were about profanity and crude content. Schools banning T-shirts. Parents writing angry letters. The Parents' Television Council documenting swear words. These were real consequences, and they mattered to the people involved, but they were consequences within a familiar cultural framework. Offensive content generating complaints from organized concerned citizens. The machinery of moral outrage in a democratic society. Noisy, but manageable. By the early 2000s, the targets had escalated to institutions. Scientology. The Catholic Church. The Mormon faith. The MPAA. These were organizations with real power, legal power, financial power, cultural power, and South Park engaged each of them directly. The Scientology controversy involved potential litigation, corporate maneuvering, and the genuinely tragic personal story of Isaac Hayes. The MPAA battle involved months of negotiation and a film that had to be submitted 6 times to earn permission to exist. These were not letters to network executives. These were conflicts with institutions. It is worth pausing on the Mormon episode specifically, because it illustrates something about the show's approach that gets missed when the focus is only on the controversies that generated the loudest opposition. The episode All About Mormons, which aired on the 19th of November 2003, was one of the most thorough and detailed takedowns of a religion's founding mythology ever broadcast on American television. It depicted Joseph Smith, the Book of Mormon, the Golden Plates, the Seer Stones, and the various elements of the faith's origin story with complete accuracy and no small amount of editorial skepticism, punctuated by repeated on-screen text expressing disbelief. It was, by any measure, a savage piece of work. The Mormon Church's response was essentially, fine. They did not boycott. They did not threaten lawsuits. They did not organize media campaigns. Church spokespeople acknowledged the episode existed, noted that they disagreed with its characterization, and moved on. Parker later said he was genuinely impressed by this response, and that the respect he developed for the Mormon community's equanimity about being satirized was a significant factor in his and Stone's decision to eventually create the Book of Mormon, the Broadway musical that affectionately and irreverently explored the same territory. A South Park episode about Mormons led, by a complicated but traceable path, to one of the most commercially successful and critically acclaimed stage musicals of the 21st century. Tony Award-winning. Still running, still earning. The controversy was the seed of the art form. This contrast between institutions that engaged with South Park through litigation and pressure campaigns and institutions that simply absorb the satire with good humor, is one of the more revealing aspects of the show's history. Organizations that threatened the show tended to generate more attention for the episode and more sympathy for Parker and Stone. Organizations that shrugged tended to find the controversy fading relatively quickly. The Mormon Church's response was, in retrospect, strategically sophisticated. By refusing to amplify the controversy, they denied the episode the institutional antagonist it needed to sustain media attention. Scientology's response was the opposite, and the Scientology controversy burned much longer and did much more lasting damage to the church's public image. Then came the Muhammad episodes, and the stakes shifted again. This was no longer about insults and lawsuits. This was about physical safety. Parker and Stone walked around for weeks with security details. The New York City Police Department deployed resources to protect a network building. The FBI opened an investigation. A man was eventually imprisoned for 25 years, not primarily for the threats he made against Parker and Stone, but for ties to a foreign terrorist organization that his behavior in the South Park controversy had helped bring to law enforcement's attention. The consequences had moved into the territory of genuine physical danger. Banned in China represented another escalation, geopolitical. An entire nation of 1.4 billion people was cut off from the show's content by a government that had the technical and legal means to erase it from their internet infrastructure. The ban affected not just South Park, but American streaming platforms' prospects in the Chinese market. Bloomberg News reported on Apple's reluctance to bid for streaming rights specifically because of the China situation. The show's defiance had real economic and diplomatic dimensions. And then 2025. Official White House condemnation. An American presidential administration issuing formal statements to entertainment publications about a cartoon they found objectionable. The president reportedly seething, press secretaries typing statements about fourth-rate shows. The full weight of the American executive branch's communications apparatus directed, in part, at two guys from Colorado who have been making construction paper comedy since 1992. Each rung on this ladder is higher than the last. And the show has not flinched at any of them. Not once has Parker and Stone looked at the size of the entity opposing them and concluded that maybe this one was too big to take on. If anything, the pattern suggests the opposite. The bigger the target, the more energized they seem to be by it. The explanation Parker offered in the New York Times, that politics had become pop culture, that the political had saturated everything else, captures something real about why the conflicts have gotten bigger. South Park used to operate in a separate sphere from genuine power. Celebrities, churches, and rating boards were significant but ultimately manageable adversaries. When the show began engaging more directly with the presidency, with national governments, with the institutions that hold actual governing power over actual people's lives, it entered a different kind of arena. And it entered that arena carrying the same tools it had always carried. Construction paper characters, 6-day production schedules, and an absolute refusal to treat anyone as beyond the reach of a well-constructed joke. What the show has discovered, over and over and over again, is that the joke works on the powerful the same way it works on everyone else. Maybe more so. Because the powerful have more invested in being taken seriously, the joke is more threatening to them. And because they have more resources to respond, their responses tend to be bigger and louder and more public than the responses of lesser targets. The White House does not issue press releases about shows it considers genuinely irrelevant. It issues press releases about shows it considers threatening. The press release was evidence of exactly the opposite of what it claimed. Section 11.5. The economics of being unfireable. There is an aspect of South Park's controversy history that almost never gets discussed, and it might be the most important structural explanation for why the show has survived everything it has survived. The economics. South Park is, by the standards of television, at its cultural level, extraordinarily cheap to produce. The animation style, while technically sophisticated in ways that are not visible to the casual viewer, does not require the massive budgets of traditionally animated series, or the enormous investment of computer-generated imagery at the level of major studio animation. Parker and Stone voice the vast majority of the characters themselves. The writing staff is small. The 6-day production cycle means there is essentially no wasted time in the development process, no extended development hell, no lengthy testing phase, no army of consultants reviewing scripts. Episodes go from concept to broadcast in approximately the time it takes to write a decent academic paper. This means the profit margins on South Park are, relative to other shows of comparable cultural impact, enormous. And high profit margins translate directly into creative leverage. When you are generating substantial returns on a modest investment, you can afford to be controversial in ways that a show with massive overhead simply cannot. The worst-case scenario, an episode gets pulled, a market access gets lost, a sponsor relationship ends, is survivable, because the financial foundation of the show does not depend on any single one of those relationships. This is the economic dimension of what looks, on the surface, like pure creative courage. Parker and Stone are genuinely brave, in the sense that they say things they know will generate powerful opposition. But they are also operating from a position of financial security that most creators never achieve, and that security enables a kind of creative risk-taking that would be genuinely reckless for someone in a more precarious position. The China ban cost the show market access, and probably some streaming deal opportunities. It did not threaten the show's survival, because the show's survival was not dependent on the Chinese market. The White House condemnation generated pressure and probably some advertiser nervousness. It did not threaten the show's survival, because 6-day production cycle animation, with a lean crew, and a self-sufficient writing operation, does not need the same level of commercial support that a traditionally produced drama requires. South Park is also, in a very practical sense, almost impossible to cancel. The show is Comedy Central's most recognizable and valuable intellectual property. Canceling it would be the equivalent of a music label deciding to stop releasing its most popular artist's catalog. The financial and reputational costs of that decision would almost certainly exceed any benefit derived from the reduced controversy. Parker and Stone understand this. Comedy Central understands this. Viacom and Paramount, the successive corporate parents, understand this. And Parker and Stone have always understood that this understanding gives them room to operate that other creators simply do not have. This is also why the $1.5 billion deal signed in July of 2025, the same day that Sermon on the Mount aired, is not in tension with the show's identity. It is an expression of it. Paramount is paying that figure precisely because the show is controversial, because the controversy generates attention, because the attention generates viewers, and because those viewers represent a massive and reliable audience for Paramount's streaming platform. A polite, inoffensive version of South Park would be worth a fraction of what the actual version is worth. The controversy is not the price Paramount is paying for the creative freedom. The controversy is the thing Paramount is buying. They are paying $1.5 billion for a show that will continue to make the White House issue press releases and continue to get banned from authoritarian countries and continue to push buttons that other properties are too careful or too expensive to push. The commercial logic of controversy, which Parker and Stone figured out in 1998 when the April Fool's prank drove their ratings to historic highs, has sustained the show across every administration, every cultural shift, every institutional opposition it has faced. And it will probably sustain it for as long as Parker and Stone choose to keep making it. It is worth sitting with. At the end of all of this, what 28 seasons of this specific kind of controversy actually represents. Not the individual episodes or the individual battles, but the whole arc of it. The shape of something that has been consistently doing the same thing, refusing to be silenced, refusing to self-censor, refusing to treat any target as immune for nearly 3 decades. At escalating levels of risk, and with consistently increasing stakes. Most shows do not last 3 decades. Of the shows that were on the air when South Park premiered in 1997, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, King of the Hill, Ally McBeal, Dharma and Greg, none are still making new episodes. The longevity is not an accident. It is not even primarily a matter of quality, though the show has produced extraordinary work across its run. The longevity is structural. It comes from the 6-day production cycle that keeps the show permanently contemporary. It comes from the willingness to throw out whatever is not working and respond to what is actually happening in the world right now. It comes from the feedback loop, Controversy generates attention. Attention generates viewers. Viewers generate revenue. Revenue funds more episodes. More episodes generate new controversy. And it comes from something that is harder to quantify, but is genuinely there when you look at the show's history carefully. A consistent, underlying philosophy. Not a political party affiliation, not an ideology in the conventional sense. A set of commitments that run through everything, the early fart jokes and the late political satire alike. Think for yourself. Do not follow mobs. Do not let fear make your decisions. Do not take yourself so seriously that you become incapable of being questioned. When the show mocked Scientology, it was arguing for independent thought. When it refused to be censored on the Muhammad question, it was arguing against the governance of fear. When it called out Hollywood's relationship with China, it was arguing against the subordination of values to markets. When it put the president in bed with Satan, it was arguing against the idolization of power. These are not particularly partisan positions. They are not left-wing or right-wing in their essence. They are the positions of people who find the pretension to uncritical reverence, wherever it appears and in whatever form it takes, to be genuinely funny and genuinely worth puncturing. Matt Stone said it years ago, in a context that has been quoted and requoted, "You cannot do satire if there are certain things you are not allowed to make fun of." That principle is sound. It does not mean every specific joke the show has ever made has been correct or fair or well-aimed. Some have been wrong. Some have aged badly. Some caused real hurt to specific people who did not deserve it. The show has been honest about some of these. The man-bear-pig correction, which involved Parker and Stone literally acknowledging on screen that they had been wrong about climate change for 12 years, remains one of the most remarkable instances of public creative self-correction in the medium's history. But the principle underneath the imperfect execution has been consistent. In a media landscape that is increasingly dominated by content designed to offend no one, content calibrated by algorithms to produce maximum engagement with minimum friction, content produced by corporations who have measured exactly how much of anyone's actual opinion they can afford to express, a show that has spent 28 years refusing to calibrate its offense to anyone's comfort represents something specific and real, not heroic in an uncomplicated way. The Indiana Jones episode exists. The sexualization of violence exists. There are episodes that went places they should not have gone. The record is not clean, but the commitment to say the thing, to not look away from the thing, to follow the joke to wherever it actually leads, regardless of who it makes uncomfortable, that commitment has been genuine and it has been consistent. South Park started in 1992 as a 5-minute piece of construction paper made by two students who were mostly interested in making each other laugh. It has since battled the MPAA, several major religions, Scientology's legal department, the internet censorship apparatus of the Chinese Communist Party, and 2 different waves of American presidential administrations. It has received death threats and Emmy nominations and an Oscar nomination for Best Original Song. It has been praised by GLAAD and condemned by the Catholic League in the same year. It has been banned from a country of 1.4 billion people and welcomed back into the homes of millions of other people who consider each new controversy as something close to a celebration. The show signed a $1.5 billion deal and immediately used the first episode to satirize the deal itself. Jesus appeared at South Park Elementary to explain that he was there because of a legal settlement with Paramount, and the joke landed because it was true, and because Parker and Stone had put it in the show anyway, and because Paramount had approved it anyway, and because everyone involved understood that the controversy is not the obstacle. The controversy is the show. There is something worth understanding about what it means for a show to be genuinely free. Not theoretically free, not free on paper, but actually operationally free in the way that it moves through the world. Most shows exist within invisible fences. The fences are made of advertiser relationships, corporate ownership structures, political sensitivities, the career interests of the people making the show, the audience relationships those people have spent years building. These are real constraints, and they shape what gets made in ways that are often invisible to the audience. You watch a show and you think you are seeing what the creators wanted to make. Often you are seeing the version that survived the gauntlet of everything the creators were not allowed to do. South Park has those fences too. It has a corporate parent. It has advertiser relationships. It has career interests and audience relationships. But the fences are further out than on almost any other show that has ever been made at this scale and for this long. Parker and Stone have pushed those fences outward, year by year and controversy by controversy, until the territory they can operate in is vastly larger than what most creators ever achieve. And they have done it not by avoiding consequences, the bans and the threats and the official condemnations are real consequences, but by treating consequences as acceptable costs of the practice they are committed to. You are going to make some people very angry. That is the cost. Pay it and keep working. 338 episodes, 28 seasons, 6 banned episodes, all of them banned not because of anything offensive in a conventional sense, but because the fear of violence, the fear of governments, the fear of powerful institutions intervened and demanded silence. And the show has never been silent for long. It goes quiet for a year or 2 years, and then it comes back and immediately does the thing that makes the White House issue a press release. And the press release confirms, as all press releases of this kind confirm, that the show matters. That a cartoon made of construction paper in a Colorado mountain town, with 4 children at its center and 2 former film students behind the camera, has been saying things that people in positions of genuine power genuinely do not want said, and keeps saying them, week after week, season after season. For nearly 3 decades, there is something valuable about that, even when the individual execution falls short of the principle, even when the joke misses, even when the target deserved better. The commitment to the practice, to the idea that comedy requires the freedom to go anywhere, that satire demands the willingness to say the thing no one wants to hear, that the most powerful people and institutions are precisely the ones most in need of having their self-importance deflated, is real, and it is rare, and it is worth taking seriously precisely because it refuses to take itself seriously. Trey Parker stood at Comic-Con in July of 2025, having just been told by the White House of the United States of America that his show was fourth-rate and irrelevant, and he looked into the camera and said, "We're terribly sorry." And then he held the stare for 5 seconds. And then the room laughed. Because everyone in that room knew what it meant. It meant we are not sorry. It meant we are going to keep doing this. It meant the show is 28 years old, and the most powerful office on Earth just acknowledged that it was paying attention. It meant the planets had aligned again, the way Eileen Katz said they aligned in 1997, except this time, the alignment was between a construction paper cartoon and the full communicative apparatus of the executive branch of the United States government. And the cartoon was winning the argument, and everyone knew it. That is South Park versus the US government. That is what 3 decades of building something deliberately uncomfortable looks like when it is still standing. Crude, vulgar, occasionally wrong, frequently brilliant, consistently itself, and never, ever sorry in a way that counts. 4 paper kids in a Colorado mountain town, saying the things no one else will say. Still here. Still watching. Still, apparently, terribly sorry. Thank you so much for spending time with this one tonight. Whether you made it all the way through, or you drifted off somewhere in the middle, that's genuinely what we are here for. If you are still with us, we really appreciate it. If this kind of deep storytelling is what you want more of, please consider subscribing to the North Park channel. It makes an enormous difference in what we are able to keep making for you. And if you enjoyed this one, leave a comment, tell us what you thought, tell us what story you want to hear next. Every comment helps, and we read all of them. Until next time, sleep well. Script for North Park, northpark.youtube.com/@NorthPark. Topic: Fall asleep to South Park 5s. The U.S. government. A note on the show's place in history. When historians eventually write about American television in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, South Park will occupy a specific and unusual position. It will not be described the way prestige dramas are described as works that elevated the medium, that demonstrated what television could achieve when treated as a serious artistic form. It will be described differently. It will be described as the show that demonstrated what the medium could survive, what an audience could absorb, engage with, and return to week after week. What 2 creators could say without the infrastructure of respectability protecting them. without the armor of critical prestige, without the shield of institutional approval. The show has operated for nearly 30 years in a space that most of the industry treats as impossible, commercially enormous, and aesthetically unrespectable. Enormously profitable and frequently embarrassing to its corporate parents. Critically acclaimed in certain quarters and condemned by essentially every organized moral lobbying organization that paid attention to television in the last 3 decades. The MPAA, the PTC, the Catholic League, the Chinese Communist Party, the White House of the United States of America. What South Park reveals, in its total arc, is something about the relationship between comfort and culture. The most comfortable content is never the most important content. The shows that played it safest, that offended the fewest people, that stayed furthest from genuine controversy, those shows entertained people and then they were over. And mostly they are remembered, if at all, as pleasant period pieces. The shows that pushed, that argued, that made people genuinely uncomfortable in ways that led somewhere. Those shows changed things. Changed what was permissible to say. Changed how certain subjects could be discussed. Changed the cultural permission structure around specific kinds of speech. South Park changed all of those things. It did not do it cleanly or without error or without causing real harm along the way, but it changed them. The world that South Park inhabits in 2025 is measurably different from the world it arrived in 1997. And some of that difference is directly attributable to the show's sustained, consistent, relentless insistence on saying the thing. 4 construction paper kids, a Colorado mountain town. 2 former film students who are still primarily interested in making each other laugh. And 30 years of telling every government, every institution, every self-appointed moral authority, and every White House press secretary exactly the same thing. We're terribly sorry. There is one more thing worth saying before we close, and it is about memory. The controversies that South Park generates tend to be remembered better than the controversies they comment on. More people can tell you that South Park got banned from China than can tell you the specific details of the Xinjiang internment situation that the Banned in China episode referenced. More people can tell you that South Park got death threats over the Muhammad episodes than can give you a detailed account of the Gillen's Poston cartoon controversy that preceded it. More people know the story of Isaac Hayes' departure from the show than know the specific history of Scientology's litigation practices against journalists and critics. This is not a criticism. It is just an observation about how cultural memory works, and about what it means that South Park consistently functions as the more memorable half of the controversies it engages. The show enters the public consciousness in a way that the underlying issues often do not. And when people want to understand what the underlying issues were, they frequently encounter South Park's version first. This is the specific power of the form. Comedy, delivered in a consistent aesthetic package, with recurring characters who have been part of people's lives for decades, has a mnemonic quality that editorial journalism and documentary film often cannot match. You remember the joke. The joke carries the argument with it, and 10 years later, you still remember both. That is not nothing. That is actually quite a lot. South Park has been making people remember things, in spite of themselves, for 28 years. It will probably keep doing it. The next controversy is already being planned in some writers' room, by 2 men who have been doing this since they were film students in Colorado in the early 1990s. The next White House press release is in some sense already being drafted. And when it arrives, the show will survive it. The same way it has survived every previous attempt to silence it, or diminish it, or declare it irrelevant. Because it always has, and because it always will, and because we will be here for all of it, watching and listening, and occasionally, if we are lucky, falling asleep to the sound of 2 guys from Colorado refusing, one more time, to be sorry about anything that matters.